A glass of American whiskey in the year 1880 could easily contain creosote. It could contain tobacco extract, diluted sulfuric acid, or a dash of iodine for color. None of that was rare. None of it was even hidden particularly well. Buyers in the saloons of Chicago or Cincinnati had no real way to tell a genuine 4-year-old whiskey from a barrel of raw grain alcohol dressed up with burnt sugar and a convincing label. Out of that chaos came, eventually, one of the tightest legal definitions ever written for a consumer product in the United States. Bourbon ended up bound by federal rules so specific they dictate the exact wood of the barrel, the exact grain ratio, the exact proof at which the spirit can leave the still. And yet, buried inside that same wall of regulation sits a strange gap. Nothing in the law requires bourbon to be made in Kentucky. It never did. That gap did not happen by accident, and it did not happen through neglect. It happened because a Kentucky senator, writing the law that was supposed to protect his own state's signature product, chose not to mention his state at all. Understanding why takes a trip back almost 2 centuries to a tax revolt, a river full of flatboats, and a chemist who never bothered to patent the thing that made bourbon taste like bourbon in the first place. The story starts with money the young United States government desperately needed. In 1791, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton pushed through a tax on distilled spirits. Farmers on the western edge of Pennsylvania felt it hardest. Corn grown that far from the coast was too bulky and too cheap to haul over the mountains as raw grain. Distilled into whiskey, it became compact, valuable, and easy to move on horseback. Hamilton's tax turned that lifeline into a liability almost overnight. Armed farmers tarred and feathered the tax collectors sent to their districts. One of those collectors, John Neville, watched a mob burn his house to the ground outside Pittsburgh. Historians would later call the whole affair the Whiskey Rebellion. President Washington rode out personally at the head of nearly 13,000 militia troops to put it down, and the revolt collapsed without a real battle. But plenty of those rebellious farmers drew a clear lesson from the experience. Distance from Washington was worth more than any argument in court. Neville's own estate, known locally as Bower Hill, had been one of the finest homes in the region before the mob got to it. Federal marshals barely escaped with their lives trying to serve warrants in the same district months later. Washington's show of force ended the uprising on paper, but plenty of the men who had taken up arms simply melted back into the hills rather than face a magistrate. Many of them, mostly of Scots, Irish, and German stock, packed up and crossed the Appalachians into a stretch of frontier that still technically belonged to Virginia. It would soon become the state of Kentucky. The journey there was brutal. Families dragged wagons along narrow mountain trails, lost livestock to exhaustion, and buried children who didn't survive the crossing. Whoever made it through found land nobody had a clean legal claim to yet, corn that grew thicker than anywhere back east, and water filtered through miles of limestone bedrock. Nobody crossed those mountains chasing limestone water on purpose. They were running from a tax collector and an army. The mineral content turned out to matter anyway. Limestone strips iron out of groundwater and adds calcium, which happens to be exactly what fermenting yeast wants. None of the settlers knew that chemistry.
They only knew their corn grew well, their whiskey came out cleaner than back east, and they had far more grain than any market within reach could absorb. Among those early settlers was a German immigrant named Jacob Beam, whose family name had originally been spelled Bohm. He sold his first barrel of corn whiskey in 1795. He had no idea he was founding a dynasty that would carry the Beam name through 6 generations of distillers. He also had no idea his whiskey would eventually be called bourbon. In his own lifetime, what came off a Kentucky still had no brand name at all. It was simply corn whiskey, clear, harsh, and barely aged. Beam wasn't the only one who later claimed the title of founder. Evan Williams, a Welsh-born merchant in Louisville, insisted decades afterward that he had distilled his first batch back in 1783. No surviving tax record or property deed backs that date up with any certainty.
Paper trails from that period are thin and often contradict each other outright. Half a dozen distilling families built their own founding myths this way, each one placing itself first in a race nobody had bothered to officiate at the time. The Samuels, the Wathans, and the Medleys followed a similar path, handing down stills and grain formulas from father to son across generations. Each family guarded its exact mash bill, the ratio of corn, rye, and malted barley, almost like a household religion. Only the chosen heir got the full recipe. Small shifts in that ratio were enough to separate one family's whiskey from its neighbors, and eventually, those family names turned into brand names that outlasted the families themselves by a wide margin. The most repeated legend about bourbon's birth involves a Baptist preacher named Elijah Craig. As the story goes, Craig stored his whiskey in new barrels that had been scorched black by an accidental fire.
Using the barrels anyway out of necessity, he supposedly discovered that the char pulled a golden color and a smooth vanilla sweetness out of the raw spirit. It is a wonderful story. It shows up in tourist brochures, in gift shop plaques, and in documentary after documentary. Historians combing through the surviving colonial records have never found a single contemporary document to support it. None of that means Craig was unimportant. He genuinely ran one of the earliest formal distilleries in Kentucky, and he also founded a college, a paper mill, and a textile plant, which is a fairly remarkable resume without any barrel legend attached to it. The fire story itself doesn't appear in print until the late 1800s, decades after Craig had died, published in local histories that wanted Kentucky to have a tidy origin myth.
A single lucky accident makes a far better tale than a slow, unglamorous technical evolution. So, the industry adopted it wholesale for its own advertising, without ever checking whether it was true. The real explanation is duller and considerably more interesting once you look closely. Distillers commonly reused barrels that had previously held salted fish, whose smell was nearly impossible to scrub out any other way. Charring the inside burned off that odor and sterilized the wood at the same time. On top of that, most Kentucky whiskey traveled down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans on flatboats, a trip that could last several weeks through increasingly hot, humid air the further south the current carried it. That river journey did more to shape the finished spirit than any single bonfire ever could. Heat expanded and contracted the barrel staves over and over, forcing the liquid in and out of the charred wood's pores. Coopers, the craftsmen who built the barrels, developed their own techniques for controlling how deep that char ran. Light for a hint of vanilla, deep for something closer to caramel and baking spice. None of it was written down in any manual. The knowledge lived entirely in a cooper's hands and passed from father to son inside family workshops. Building the barrel itself took real skill that had nothing to do with fire. Staves had to be cut, bent over open flame, and fitted without a single nail or drop of glue holding the whole thing together. A cooper who rushed the job produced a barrel that leaked whiskey straight through its seams for the entire length of a river voyage. An expensive mistake nobody in the trade could afford to make twice. Good coopers were paid almost as well as the distillers themselves, since a ruined barrel meant a ruined batch, no matter how carefully the mash had been fermented. Formal science finally arrived with James Crowe, a Scottish-trained physician and chemist who joined the Oscar Pepper distillery sometime in the 1830s. Crowe treated a craft that had run on instinct and folklore for decades like a laboratory problem. He measured fermentation temperatures, tracked the exact acidity of his grain, and logged every batch with a discipline nobody in the business had bothered with before. Out of those experiments came the sour mash method, feeding a portion of one fermented batch into the next to keep every run consistent. Crowe died without patenting a thing, and every distiller in Kentucky was free to copy him. One brand later took his own name outright, selling itself as Old Crowe, long after the man who inspired it had passed away without collecting a cent from it. The earliest known printed reference to whiskey, specifically labeled Bourbon, appears in an advertisement in the Western Citizen newspaper around 1821. It named whiskey shipped from Bourbon County, a stretch of Kentucky named back in 1785 in honor of the French royal family that had backed the American colonists during their war for independence. Over the following decades, that original county split into several smaller ones, each keeping its own separate name for administrative purposes. The name Bourbon stuck to the whiskey itself, regardless of the county lines shifting underneath it. That stretch of river frontage remained a standard shipping point for barrels heading downstream to New Orleans, and buyers down south began asking for bourbon whiskey the same way they'd ask for a product with a known, trusted origin. What started as a shipping label eventually swallowed the product's identity whole, long before anyone in Washington thought to regulate any of it. Before that name took hold, there simply wasn't a fixed category for what these distillers made.
Barrels went out marked corn whiskey, rye whiskey, or nothing at all beyond the name of the man who distilled it. Rye producers over in Pennsylvania and Maryland actually outsold Kentucky corn whiskey for much of the early 1800s, and plenty of drinkers along the eastern seaboard considered rye the more respectable pour of the two. Kentucky's corn-heavy spirit only pulled ahead once Prohibition gutted the rye-producing states far more thoroughly than it gutted Kentucky's own distilling base. A twist of regional fortune that had nothing to do with taste and everything to do with which farms and factories happened to survive 13 dry years intact. For decades after that, Kentucky whiskey production grew with essentially no federal oversight worth mentioning. Any farmer with a still could brew and sell liquor under whatever name he liked. That freedom, which had originally been a workaround against Hamilton's tax, curdled over time into something far more dangerous. Once real money started moving through the whiskey trade, it drew in a different kind of operator entirely. These weren't farmers working off a corn surplus anymore. They were city businessmen who had figured out how to fake the taste of aged whiskey without waiting years or spending a fortune on actual grain. The trade called them rectifiers. Their method was simple: buy cheap neutral spirit distilled in enormous industrial volume, then dose it with caramel coloring, artificial flavoring, and whatever else approximated the taste of a properly aged product. The finished blend went out under labels nearly identical to those of legitimate Kentucky distillers. Some rectifiers went further, cutting their product with genuinely dangerous chemicals to chase a more convincing amber color, and period complaints mentioned creosote, tobacco extract, and diluted sulfuric acid showing up in the mix. A bottle proudly labeled 10 years old might have been sitting in a warehouse for exactly 2 days before a customer bought it off a shelf. Nobody checking the label had any way of confirming that gap between claim and reality. Some rectifying outfits even bought up the actual paper labels of failed honest distilleries at auction, printing convincing new stock that traded on a reputation the original owners had spent decades earning honestly. By 1887, a cluster of these rectifiers had merged into a single corporate giant called the Distillers and Cattle Feeders Trust. At its peak, the trust controlled somewhere near 80% of the country's neutral grain alcohol capacity. Its head, Joseph Greenhut, ran pricing from an office in Peoria, Illinois, a long way from any Kentucky limestone spring. The trust squeezed small independent distillers with deliberate price wars, forcing them to either sell out or watch their margins get wiped out entirely. The federal government eventually turned on the very monopoly it had allowed to metastasize for years. Under the newly passed Sherman Antitrust Act, prosecutors filed suit against the combine early in the new century, and courts ordered it broken apart. Some of the plants Greenhut had absorbed found their way back to the families that had lost them under pressure. That legal victory came far too late for the smaller operators who had already closed their doors for good years before it landed. There was a strange twist buried in that breakup too. Several plants the trust had swallowed up were technically worth more broken apart than they had ever been worth combined, since buyers were willing to pay a premium just to own a recognizable old family name again. Investors who had nothing to do with whiskey in the first place scooped up a handful of those recognizable brands purely as a speculative bet on nostalgia, years before the industry itself had any inkling that nostalgia would become the whole business model. Fraud wasn't only a moral problem, it was an existential threat to any distiller who actually aged their product honestly for years, paying for storage, evaporation losses, and barrel costs the whole time. A rectifier could turn out a convincing fake in a matter of days at a fraction of that cost, undercut honest producers on price, and still pocket enormous margins. Consumers had no reliable way to tell the difference standing in front of a shelf full of nearly identical bottles. The corruption reached well past a few dishonest merchants. In 1875, Treasury investigators uncovered a sprawling conspiracy that came to be known as the Whiskey Ring.
Corrupt federal supervisors and major distillers colluded to falsify production records and dodge the federal liquor tax across several states, including Missouri, Illinois, and Wisconsin, siphoning off millions of dollars that should have gone to the government. More than 230 people were eventually indicted, among them Orville Babcock, President Ulysses Grant's own private secretary. Treasury Secretary Benjamin Bristow ran the investigation personally, planting undercover agents in St. Louis, the heart of the scheme, disguised as ordinary grain merchants. What they found was that the very federal supervisors assigned to police distillers were taking regular bribes from the men they were supposed to be watching. Grant, under enormous press pressure, publicly declared that no guilty man should escape, regardless of rank or connections. His enthusiasm cooled noticeably once the investigation started closing in on people uncomfortably close to his own inner circle.
Out of that swamp of fraud rose a Kentucky businessman determined to change the industry from inside it. Edmund Haynes Taylor Jr. had worked as a banker before turning his full attention to distilling. His plant, known as the OFC Distillery, ran on procedures he documented with something close to scientific rigor. Taylor understood that no amount of honest craftsmanship would save his business long-term against rectifiers who could undercut him at will. The fix wasn't just a better whiskey. It was convincing the government to draw a legal line between real whiskey and a chemical impersonation of it. Taylor built OFC with a grandeur nobody expected from a whiskey plant, classical columns out front, and tall windows flooding light across the copper stills inside. He invited journalists and government officials in for tours, walking them through every stage of distillation and aging with obvious pride. That openness was a deliberate contrast to the rectifiers, who never let an outsider anywhere near their operations. Taylor understood something the fraudsters never grasped. Trust gets built by showing people the process, not by promising quality on a printed label. He wasn't the only honest operator fighting back. In 1870, a merchant named George Garvin Brown launched a brand called Old Forester. Brown made a call that seemed almost reckless at the time. He sold his whiskey exclusively in sealed bottles, never from a loose barrel. Most whiskey at the time was sold straight from the cask at the point of sale, where any dishonest shopkeeper could water it down or blend it with cheaper stock before it ever reached a customer. By sealing every bottle under his own signature, Brown offered something no rectifier could easily fake, a verifiable promise about what was actually inside. Taylor's push for federal regulation dragged on for almost 2 decades, backed by other honest distillers who saw their livelihoods under direct threat. He made repeated trips to Washington, lobbied Kentucky's congressional delegation, and drafted technical proposals on how authentic whiskey production should be supervised. His central argument was hard to argue against. If the government already taxed every barrel produced, it could just as easily certify what was inside that barrel. That campaign paid off on March 28, 1897, when President Grover Cleveland signed the Bottled in Bond Act into law. The rules were strict. Whiskey carrying the government's seal had to come from a single distillery and a single production season, with no blending across batches or producers. It had to age at least 4 years inside a warehouse under direct federal supervision. It had to be bottled at exactly 100 proof, with no additives or artificial coloring introduced after distillation. Legal historians consider this the first consumer protection law of its kind anywhere in the country. Before 1897, no food or beverage product carried a government-backed guarantee of authenticity. The green strip, printed by the government's own engraving bureau, sealed across the cork and neck of every bottled-in-bond whiskey, became an instant mark of trust for buyers. Rectifiers, unable to display it, were suddenly exposed for exactly what they were: manufacturers of imitation product with no oversight standing behind them. Those bonded warehouses ran under an unusual double lock, one key held by the distiller, one by a federal agent, so that no barrel could move or open without both parties present. And inside those stone and timber warehouses, a portion of the aging whiskey simply vanished every year without any thief ever touching it.
Summer heat expanded the barrel wood and pushed alcohol vapors straight out through the pores in the oak. Distillers nicknamed that yearly loss the Angel's Share, a phenomenon no technology could fully stop. Over decades, that escaping vapor blackened the timbers and stone of a warehouse from the outside. So anyone in the business could spot an aging house from a distance, just by the color of its walls. The fight between honest distillers and rectifiers didn't end there, though. Chemist Harvey Wiley, who ran a government lab nicknamed the Poison Squad, spent years analyzing adulterated food and drink samples from across the country. His findings helped push through the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which forced every producer to accurately declare what was actually inside a bottled product, whiskey included. Rectifiers argued their blended product deserved to be called whiskey with the same legitimacy as anything aged the traditional way.
The dispute got so heated it landed on President William Howard Taft's own desk in 1909. Taft spent weeks hearing arguments from both sides before issuing what became known as the Taft Decision. He ruled that rectifiers could keep selling their product, but only under the label blended whiskey, never as plain bourbon without qualification. Straight whiskey and the unqualified word bourbon that came with it was reserved for spirit distilled purely from fermented grain and aged without blending or additives. A sitting president, acting almost as referee in a commercial dispute, cemented in law a distinction the honest side of the industry had been fighting for since Taylor's earliest campaigns. None of this wiped out rectifiers overnight, but it permanently reshaped the market. Honest distillers finally had a legal tool to separate themselves from their fraudulent competitors, and for the first time, customers could trust a label at face value.
Edmund Haynes Taylor, Jr. earned a lasting reputation as the father of modern bourbon. Recognition for turning a chaotic, often dangerous business into a regulated, respectable industry. Barely 2 decades after that victory, though, the entire trade would face a threat far more serious than any rectifier. On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution took effect. The production, transport, and sale of alcoholic beverages became illegal across the entire country. The Volstead Act, which spelled out how the amendment would be enforced, forced nearly every distillery in the nation to shut down almost overnight. In some warehouses, federal agents personally opened barrels of aging whiskey and poured the contents straight onto the ground, while distillers, who had waited years for that liquor, stood and watched.
According to accounts from the period, the smell of spilled whiskey lingered over parts of Kentucky for days after those court-ordered destructions. Families who had distilled for generations, the Beams among them, watched their entire livelihood disappear overnight. The shutdown didn't only hurt distillers, it gutted thousands of farmers who had never distilled a drop of whiskey in their lives, but had always sold their corn crops straight to the distilleries down the road, a stable buyer that paid fair prices season after season. Without that buyer, those same farmers scrambled for other markets for a surplus that had never been hard to sell before. Entire counties whose economies leaned heavily on the whiskey trade slid into a quiet crisis that rarely made it into the national headlines about gangsters and bootleggers, which mostly focused on the big cities instead of Kentucky's struggling small towns.
Some distilleries tried to survive by repurposing their equipment for other legal industrial uses during those dry years, turning out vinegar, commercial yeast, or industrial fuel alcohol instead. That kept buildings running and machinery from rusting, but the specialized skill of actually distilling whiskey slowly bled away from workers forced into other trades to make a living. When Prohibition ended, a handful of those repurposed plants managed to switch back fairly quickly. Others never distilled another drop. The federal government did leave one narrow crack in the wall of Prohibition. The law still allowed whiskey to be sold for strictly medicinal purposes, provided a doctor wrote a prescription and a licensed pharmacy filled it. Only 6 companies nationwide received federal permission to produce and bottle that medicinal whiskey across the 13 years Prohibition lasted. Brown-Forman, the company George Garvin Brown had built around Old Forester, was one of them.
The reputation for authenticity Brown had spent decades building by sealing his bottles against fraud turned out to be exactly what secured that rare license. Not everyone who found that legal loophole played it as straight as Brown-Forman did. George Remus, a Cincinnati lawyer who had made his name defending criminals, noticed that the law let him buy entire distilleries along with their pre-Prohibition bottled inventory outright. He snapped up several shuttered Kentucky plants and secured the paperwork to withdraw that whiskey for legitimate medical distribution. Instead of delivering it to licensed pharmacies, he arranged for trucks to intercept his own shipments on quiet back roads and divert the whole load into the black market. Remus built a fortune worth millions before federal agents finally managed to dismantle his entire operation. He was hardly alone in exploiting that same medical loophole for illegal profit. Dozens of smaller operators across Kentucky and Ohio ran near-identical schemes on a much smaller scale, buying withdrawal permits, forging pharmacy paperwork, or simply bribing the federal agents assigned to watch their warehouses. Some of those men never got caught at all and quietly folded their profits into legitimate businesses once repeal finally arrived. Their fortunes never traced back to a single barrel of diverted medicinal whiskey. Doctors of the era wrote whiskey prescriptions for everything from anxiety to indigestion to plain general weakness. Pharmacies distributing that medicinal whiskey saw their business explode during those dry years. Some historians estimate the Walgreens chain grew from roughly 20 locations to several hundred in just a few years, driven in large part by that very trade.
Prescription pads for whiskey became such a routine part of a doctor's practice that pre-printed forms circulated with the diagnosis line already filled in, waiting only for a signature and a patient's name. A few physicians made a tidy side income simply signing whatever a friendly pharmacist put in front of them, no actual examination required. The rest of the whiskey industry, without that special license, sat completely frozen. Century-old distilleries closed permanently, their buildings left standing empty for more than a decade. Some of those idle warehouses found new purpose as makeshift storage for anything that needed a locked, climate-stable space, from tobacco to grain seed to, in one documented case, an entire county's surplus furniture during a courthouse renovation.
Locals in whiskey towns joked bitterly that the buildings were more useful sitting empty than most of the men who used to work inside them, thrown out of steady jobs by a law most of them had never voted for in the first place. Prohibition finally ended on December 5, 1933, when the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th. The distilleries that had survived, mostly the 6 with medicinal licenses, found themselves holding an enormous advantage over any newcomer trying to enter the business. Rebuilding a building and restarting a still could happen in a matter of months, but a genuine bourbon still needed the 4 years of aging the 1897 law demanded before it could be sold as a mature product. During that forced waiting period, the licensed companies bought up abandoned brands and distilleries at rock-bottom prices. Schenley Distillers, one of the 6 licensed firms, snapped up dozens of historic brand names within just a few years of repeal. National Distillers, another of the 6, did the same with buildings and recipes that entire families had walked away from with no capital left to reopen. Both companies understood that the real value wasn't sitting in empty buildings. It was in brand names that generations of customers still recognized instantly. They bought those names for a fraction of their worth, betting correctly that consumer loyalty had survived 13 years of forced closure completely intact. That consolidation permanently redrew the map of the bourbon business. Dozens of small family distilleries that had survived generation after generation couldn't scrape together the capital to reopen after 13 years dark. Their brands, their recipes, and in some cases their buildings all passed into the hands of the larger companies that had stayed active through Prohibition. An industry that had counted hundreds of independent distillers across Kentucky in the 1800s shrank within a single generation down to a small handful of large corporations. The old freedom of any farmer to distill his own whiskey lay buried under the combined weight of regulation and lost capital. The industry barely had time to steady itself before a second forced interruption hit. The United States entered the Second World War in 1941, and the federal government ordered distilleries to shift much of their capacity toward the war effort. Instead of whiskey, many plants turned out industrial alcohol destined for explosives and synthetic fuel for aircraft and tanks. Shenley converted several of its own plants to produce the alcohol needed for penicillin manufacturing, shipped out to field hospitals overseas. Civilian bourbon output dropped sharply for the length of the conflict.
When the war ended in 1945, the industry faced the exact same years-long wait it had already endured once after Prohibition. Veterans coming home found shelves stocked with very little properly aged whiskey. Many distillers rushed out product barely 2 or 3 years old, chasing quick revenue after 4 years without normal production. Knowledgeable drinkers noticed the drop in quality and complained openly in trade columns of the period. That gap in mature domestic supply opened a window for Scotch whiskey, imported without any of those same wartime restrictions, to win over some of the country's more demanding drinkers. While American bourbon scrambled to rebuild its aged reserves, its overseas rivals never missed a step. Scotch and Canadian whiskey had faced no equivalent prohibition during those same decades. Canada, if anything, had ramped up production specifically during America's dry years, smuggling plenty of it south across the border in the process.
By the middle of the century, Scotch carried an international prestige that bourbon still hadn't matched outside its own borders. Kentucky's bottles sold well enough at home, but struggled to find serious buyers across Europe or Asia. Part of that prestige gap came down to simple marketing polish. Scotch distillers had spent decades cultivating an image built around castles, tartan, and centuries-old family crests, an aesthetic American producers had never bothered building for themselves. Bourbon, by comparison, still carried a faint whiff of its bootlegger past in the public imagination overseas, an association nobody in Kentucky found flattering when they were trying to sell a bottle at a premium price to a skeptical foreign buyer. Bourbon producers also ran into a very specific commercial problem overseas. No international law stopped a distiller anywhere in the world from slapping the word bourbon on a bottle with zero connection to Kentucky or the United States. A cheap European corn spirit could be labeled bourbon and sold across that continent without breaking a single local rule. That unchecked competition threatened to water down the commercial value of a name American producers had spent more than a century building. France, by contrast, had spent decades legally protecting words like cognac and champagne for its own regional producers. And Britain had done something similar for Scotch through a law passed early in the 20th century. Bourbon had no equivalent shield in any international treaty on the books. Inside the domestic market, meanwhile, bourbon was losing ground to lighter, more neutral spirits like vodka and gin. Those spirits mixed more easily into the cocktails fashionable among urban drinkers through the 1950s and 60s. Bourbon makers watched with real concern as part of their traditional customer base drifted away, no advertising campaign able to fully reverse the shift. With the domestic market no longer growing at the same pace, exports became the only realistic path to real growth. That pressing need for new overseas markets is exactly what finally pushed the industry to seek legal protection on an international scale. That's the context in which Kentucky Senator Thruston Morton decided to act. By then, Kentucky produced the overwhelming majority of the country's bourbon, even though no federal law required production to stay concentrated there. Morton wasn't a newcomer to Washington politics. He had represented Kentucky for over a decade, first in the House and then in the Senate, and he knew the exact names of his state's major distilleries, along with the precise employment figures they generated across several rural counties.
Morton understood that legally protecting the bourbon name on an international level would directly benefit his state's economy, no matter what the bill's actual text said about Kentucky, which turned out to be nothing at all. On the day he brought his resolution to the floor, Morton sat among colleagues from other states with little direct stake in the whiskey trade. He knew his argument had to reach beyond Kentucky's own borders to hold up. So he wrote the resolution for the whole country's benefit, not just his own constituents back home. On May 4th, 1964, Congress passed the resolution Morton had championed. The text declared bourbon whiskey a distinctive product of the United States and directed the Treasury Department to block any foreign product labeled under that name from entering the country.
It also formalized the technical standards already defining what could legally be called bourbon. A mash bill containing at least 51% corn, distillation below 160 proof, and aging exclusively in new charred oak barrels, no exceptions. Those barrels, notably, could never be reused for another batch of bourbon once they'd served their purpose. The rule demanded fresh wood for every single aging cycle, a requirement no other whiskey tradition on earth shared with the same rigidity. Scotch producers, for comparison, took pride in reusing barrels that had once held sherry or American bourbon, treating that reuse as central to their own craft. That single technical difference turned every bourbon barrel into a one-time use product within the American industry itself. And it eventually spawned an entire secondary trade reselling those used barrels to distillers in other countries.
The Kentucky-only myth wasn't the only piece of loose marketing language floating around the industry either. Terms like small batch and single barrel, printed proudly across countless labels, carried no fixed legal definition anywhere in federal regulation. A company could call a run of 5,000 barrels a small batch with the same legal standing as a company calling 20 barrels a small batch, since no statute drew a line between the two. Consumers reading those words on a shelf had no way of knowing whether they described an actual production choice or simply a phrase a marketing department had decided sounded appealingly rare. Nothing in that 1964 resolution named Kentucky as a required place of production. The law protected the word bourbon as a national symbol, available under equal legal footing to any distiller in any of the 50 states.
A producer in New York, Texas, or Oregon could, from that day forward, make bourbon with exactly the same legal standing as any century-old Kentucky operation. Tennessee whiskey sat in an odd position right next door to all of this. Jack Daniel's satisfied every single requirement written into the federal standard for bourbon. Corn content, barrel type, proof limits, all of it. Its own state, though, insisted on calling its product Tennessee whiskey instead, built around an extra charcoal filtering step known as the Lincoln County process that Kentucky distillers didn't bother with. Plenty of drinkers who had never read a word of the actual regulation assumed the two categories were worlds apart, when the real distinction came down to one filtering step and a marketing decision, not some deep difference in what the law demanded. Morton's resolution was built as a tool of international trade policy, not as a badge of regional identity.
Its whole purpose was opening export markets, not enshrining any particular patch of geography as sacred ground. Exports responded almost immediately to that new legal protection. Buyers across Japan and Western Europe signed distribution deals that would have been unthinkable for a spirit with no recognized legal status abroad before that point. Kentucky distilleries that had sold nearly everything domestically a decade earlier watched the share of their output headed to foreign ports climb steadily. The Commerce Department began citing bourbon in its own annual reports as a standout case of an agricultural product turned into a prestige export item. That commercial shift confirmed in practice that Morton had gotten exactly the economic outcome he'd been chasing. Distillers in Kentucky leaned into the new export momentum by leaning even harder into their home state's name on packaging, even though the federal resolution had never once required them to mention it.
Labels that had previously said little more than the brand and the proof suddenly carried the word Kentucky in large lettering, sometimes bigger than the brand name itself. Distillery tour buses started rolling through the same rural counties that had once quietly starved for cash during Prohibition, selling visitors on a heritage story that blended genuine history with a fair amount of polished invention along the way. And yet almost none of that legal nuance ever reached the average drinker, picking up a bottle at the store. Kentucky's big distilleries, sitting on genuine decades of real history, had every commercial incentive to keep customers believing bourbon belonged to their state alone. Labels leaned hard on green hillsides, racehorses, and weathered timber warehouses aged by time itself.
Marketing did more to cement Kentucky's exclusive claim than any statute ever could, and that impression eventually became so powerful It simply replaced the law's actual wording in the public imagination. Looked at from any real distance, the irony is hard to miss. The law millions of drinkers assume protects bourbon's geographic origin never demanded that origin anywhere in its actual text. It came out of one senator's need to defend export numbers, not from any wish to preserve a sacred regional tradition. Morton himself, drafting that resolution, deliberately left Kentucky out of it, precisely to make the international protection stronger. Whatever myth got repeated afterward, across labels, tourist brochures, and generations of convinced enthusiasts, it never lived in any clause of federal statute. It lived in the gap between what the law actually says and what decades of advertising trained people to believe instead. Kentucky, for its part, held on to an overwhelming share of national bourbon output for decades afterward, far beyond anything a law could ever have forced. That dominance never came from any legal mandate. It came from the same mix of factors that had drawn those first Scots-Irish and German settlers across the mountains nearly 2 centuries earlier. Limestone-filtered water and a climate swinging between scorching summers and cold winters sped up the aging process inside every barrel. On top of that sat generations of distillers, passing down technical knowledge from parent to child without ever needing a written manual. No senator could legislate that kind of accumulated advantage into existence anywhere else. Geology and habit built exactly what the federal law had, quite deliberately, chosen never to write down. In the years after Morton's resolution, a handful of entrepreneurs outside Kentucky did test that rarely exercised legal freedom.
New distilleries opened in states like Virginia, New York, and Texas, turning out perfectly legal bourbon under that same federal standard. None of them, though, came with centuries of limestone-filtered water or generations of coopers passing a trade down through families. Kentucky never needed a single additional legal clause to hold on to a business the law had, quite deliberately, left open to any state in the Union. The final irony sits inside every bottle made after 1964. The law that protected the name never protected the place, and the place never actually needed that protection to remain the only one that mattered. Elijah Craig, the preacher whose accidental fire legend still turns up printed on labels and gift shop plaques, never imagined his name would end up sold as shorthand for historical authenticity.
Historians who later combed through Kentucky's colonial records found no evidence he was the first to char a barrel, and no evidence he invented anything resembling modern bourbon at all. His legend survived anyway, because a good story, repeated across enough generations, ends up sounding truer than any dull legal document ever could. Congress protected a word in 1964, written by a senator who deliberately left his own state's name off the page. Kentucky's distilleries, with decades of patience, and without ever needing one more line of statute, protected something far harder to legislate: the simple belief that the word belonged to them and to nobody